Hey guys, tonight we're doing something that almost every person alive has a quiet opinion about, even if they've never touched the stuff. Weed. Not the kind you pull out of your garden while muttering darkly at the soil. I mean cannabis. The plant that has been smoked, eaten, worshipped, criminalized, legalized, recriminalized, re-legalized, and argued about at every Thanksgiving dinner in recorded history. And here's the thing. Most people think they know what weed is. They've heard the names, indica, sativa, hybrid, whatever that guy at the dispensary called it while wearing a lanyard and speaking in a voice 3 octaves too relaxed. But the actual story of cannabis, the science, the strains, the pharmacology, the long strange trip from ancient ritual fire to a gummy bear in your bedside drawer, that story is wild, complicated, and deeply, genuinely weird. So before you get too comfortable, let me say a genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and so does your browser history. Your suggestion made it here, and that means everything to this channel. If you enjoy what I do, please like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is. And if you're catching this on Spotify, the link to the channel is right there in the description. Now dim those lights, flip on a fan, pull that blanket all the way up, and get horizontal. Because I want you to ask yourself something before we begin. Have you ever wondered why some weed makes you philosophical, and some makes you convinced you've made a terrible mistake? Why one person eats a brownie and naps peacefully, and another ends up lying perfectly still on a bathroom floor reciting their own name? Why some strains are named after desserts and others sound like names from a dystopian novel? Why the same plant can make you feel warm and giggly at 8 p.m, and then completely convinced by 11 that your ceiling has opinions? And more importantly, is there a point where weed stops being recreational and starts being a full psychological adventure you did not consent to? Congratulations. You've just asked the right questions. Let's go find out what's actually in the plant, because it turns out there's a lot going on in there, and not all of it is chill. Before we talk about what weed does to your brain, it's worth spending a moment with the plant itself, because cannabis is not one simple thing, and it never has been. Cannabis is a flowering plant from Central Asia, likely originating somewhere in the vast grasslands near the Hindu Kush mountain range, and it has been growing, spreading, and evolving alongside human civilization for somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 years. There are 3 commonly recognized species: Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Cannabis ruderalis, each with different growth patterns, different chemical profiles, and different reputations that have been argued about so passionately and for so long that the debate has essentially become its own subculture. The plant produces flowers, and inside those flowers are tiny crystalline structures called trichomes, which look under a magnifying glass like something a very creative alien would design for a miniature disco. And those trichomes are where essentially everything interesting happens. Sativa plants grow tall, genuinely tall. Left to their own devices in the right climate, a sativa can reach heights of 12 feet or more, which is the kind of fact that makes you understand why certain agricultural communities found it useful, and also why certain agricultural communities found it extremely easy to hide. Sativa originated in equatorial regions, Southeast Asia, Central America, parts of Africa, where long-growing seasons and consistent sunlight produced a plant adapted to slow, sustained development. Indica, by contrast, is compact, dense, and fast-flowering, a product of the harsh, mountainous environments of Afghanistan and Pakistan, where the growing season is short and the plant had to be efficient. Ruderalis, the 3rd species, is small, weedy, and auto-flowering, meaning it flowers based on age rather than light cycle. And while it produces very little THC on its own, breeders have spent decades crossing it with more potent varieties to create strains that are easier to grow in difficult conditions. Now here is where it gets interesting. The cannabis plant doesn't produce THC or CBD directly. It produces their acidic precursors, THCA and CBDA, which are non-psychoactive in their raw form. When you apply heat through smoking, vaping or baking, a process called decarboxylation occurs, which removes a carboxyl group from the molecule and converts the acid form into the active compound. This is why eating raw cannabis doesn't get you high. This is also the kind of fact that sounds like a chemistry class, but is actually extremely practical, and several people have learned it the hard way after confidently eating a handful of raw flower and then waiting confused for something to happen. The plant's primary evolutionary purpose in producing cannabinoids and terpenes appears to have nothing to do with human beings whatsoever. Trichomes, those crystalline structures on the flower, likely evolved as a defense mechanism against insects, UV radiation, and fungal infection. The strong smell produced by terpenes may have been designed to repel pests or attract beneficial insects. In other words, cannabis did not develop its chemical arsenal so that humans could have an interesting Friday evening. We simply discovered that the defense system the plant built for entirely unrelated reasons happened to interact with our neurobiology in fascinating ways, and then spent 10,000 years aggressively exploiting that coincidence. Today, modern cannabis cultivation has pushed the plant far beyond anything it would produce in the wild. Through selective breeding, indoor growing environments with precisely controlled light and temperature, and sophisticated nutrient programs, cultivators have produced strains with cannabinoid profiles, terpene concentrations, and structural densities that the ancestral plant from the Hindu Kush would not recognize. The plant that ancient Central Asian nomads encountered growing wild in the grasslands and the laboratory-perfect flower sitting behind glass at a modern dispensary are technically the same species. They just don't have much else in common. If cannabis were a workplace drama, THC would be the loud, charismatic employee who gets all the credit, causes most of the problems, and somehow keeps getting promoted anyway. Tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the kind of word scientists invent specifically to make the rest of us feel undereducated, is the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis, the thing responsible for the high, the hunger, the laughter, the paranoia, the conviction that you just understood something profound, and also the equally strong conviction 30 seconds later that you were completely wrong. It binds to cannabinoid receptors in the brain, specifically C-bone receptors, which are distributed throughout regions that handle memory, pleasure, time perception, coordination, and the processing of sensory information. And when it does, it produces effects that can range from gentle euphoria all the way to full-scale existential alarm, depending on the dose, the person, the setting, and approximately 40 other variables nobody has fully mapped yet. THC was first isolated and identified in 1964 by Israeli chemist Raphael Mishulam, working at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem with a kilogram of hashish he obtained, with remarkable administrative efficiency, directly from the Israeli National Police. The story of how a scientist called up the police department, explained he needed drugs for research, and received a paper bag of confiscated hashish by return favour is one of the more charming origin stories in pharmacological history, and it produced results that changed neuroscience permanently. Before McCullum's work, scientists knew cannabis produced psychoactive effects, but had no idea which compound was responsible. Isolating THC made it possible, eventually, to understand why. What THC actually does at the receptor level is mimic a naturally occurring neurotransmitter called anandamide, named, beautifully, from the Sanskrit word for bliss, which is one of the brain's own endocannabinoids. Anandamide is produced on demand by neurons and plays a role in mood regulation, pain modulation, and what researchers describe as the temporary suppression of fear memories. THC does what anandamide does, but more intensely, for longer, and without the precise regulatory control the brain's own system applies to naturally produced molecules. It's the difference between your brain turning on a light switch and someone else sitting on the dimmer for 3 to 5 hours. The effects of THC are dose-dependent in a way that matters enormously in practice. At low doses, THC tends to be pleasant, mild euphoria, relaxation, increased sociability, a general sense that the world is more interesting than it was 20 minutes ago. At higher doses, particularly in people who don't use cannabis regularly, those same mechanisms that produce pleasant effects start producing uncomfortable ones. The same amplification of sensory perception that makes music sound extraordinary at a manageable dose can feel overwhelming at a high one. The same alteration of time perception that makes an evening feel expansive can make it feel, less pleasantly, like time has stopped entirely. And then there is the question of individual variation, which is genuinely enormous. Two people consuming identical doses of identical cannabis can have profoundly different experiences, one relaxed, one anxious, one sleepy, one alert, because factors like genetics, baseline anxiety, prior experience, set and setting, and even gut microbiome composition all influence how THC is absorbed, processed, and experienced. THC is not a simple on-off switch. It is a key that unlocks different rooms for different people, and some of those rooms are considerably less comfortable than others. For most of cannabis's long history, nobody paid much attention to cannabidiol. It doesn't get you high. It doesn't produce the kind of dramatic, story-generating experiences that THC does. It just sits quietly in the background of the plant, doing its work, occasionally reducing seizures, occasionally softening anxiety, occasionally making people feel slightly better in ways that are hard to measure, and even harder to explain to a skeptic. CBD, or cannabidiol, is the second most abundant compound in the cannabis plant, and in recent years it has gone from a complete afterthought to one of the most aggressively marketed substances in modern consumer history, available in tinctures, gummies, dog treats, face creams, and at least one brand of sparkling water that nobody asked for but everyone has seen at checkout. The science of CBD is more nuanced than either its enthusiastic commercial boosters or its skeptical critics tend to acknowledge. On one hand, there is one genuinely well-established medical application. CBD is the active ingredient in Epidiolex, an FDA-approved pharmaceutical used to treat two rare and severe forms of childhood epilepsy, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome, in which it reduces seizure frequency significantly in clinical trials. This is not anecdotal. It is randomized, controlled, peer-reviewed evidence, and it represents the clearest example of a cannabis-derived compound demonstrating clinical efficacy in a rigorous scientific context. Beyond epilepsy, the evidence gets murkier but not non-existent. Studies on CBD and anxiety are reasonably encouraging, particularly in contexts involving social anxiety and performance anxiety, though most of the trials are small and the optimal dosing remains unclear. There is some evidence for benefit in pain management, particularly neuropathic pain. There are early, preliminary findings suggesting possible applications in addiction treatment, inflammation, and certain neurological conditions. None of this is settled science. Most of it qualifies as promising rather than proven, and the gap between promising and the claims you'll find on a CBD gummy wrapper is enormous. CBD also does something pharmacologically interesting that is often overlooked in commercial contexts. At certain doses, it appears to modulate the effects of THC. Specifically, CBD seems to reduce some of the anxiety and paranoia that high-dose THC can produce, possibly by acting on receptors that are separate from but adjacent to the C-bone receptor where THC binds. This is part of the reason why high THC, low CBD strains, which now dominate the commercial market because CBD doesn't contribute to the intoxicating effect consumers are paying for, are sometimes associated with more anxiety than older, more balanced varieties that contained both cannabinoids in roughly equal measure. The commercial CBD boom that began around 2018 was powered partly by genuine interest in the science, and partly by a legal loophole that allowed hemp-derived CBD to be sold before the regulatory framework for it was fully in place. The result was an explosion of products making health claims that range from vaguely plausible to actively absurd. CBD as a treatment for cancer, for Alzheimer's, for everything. accompanied by pricing that bore no relationship to the actual cost of producing the compound. The hype has since cooled somewhat. The regulatory scrutiny has increased, and what remains is a more honest conversation about what CBD actually does, which is, in summary, some genuinely useful things in specific contexts, and probably not what is written on that face cream. Here is the part of the story that genuinely surprises most people when they first hear it, even people who have been using cannabis for decades. Your brain already has a system specifically designed to respond to cannabinoids, not because evolution anticipated the existence of dispensaries, but because your body naturally produces its own cannabinoid-like molecules, called endocannabinoids, and has receptor sites throughout the central nervous system designed to receive them. The endocannabinoid system, which wasn't even officially discovered until the late 1980s, is now understood to be one of the most widespread receptor systems in the human brain and body, involved in regulating mood, sleep, appetite, pain, immune response, memory formation, and a number of other processes that scientists are still untangling. The discovery of the endocannabinoid system happened in a sequence that feels, in retrospect, almost backwards. Scientists first identified THC, then spent years wondering how it could possibly affect the brain so broadly and specifically. The answer that emerged, that the brain must contain receptor sites designed to receive cannabinoid-like molecules, and that the body must therefore produce its own, led eventually to the discovery of the C-bone receptor in 1988, and the first endocannabinoid, anandamide, in 1992. The naming was handled by Raphael Mechoulam, who proposed the term endocannabinoid by combining the word cannabinoid with the Greek prefix endo, meaning within. He named anandamide after the Sanskrit word for bliss, which is the kind of thing that makes you want to read more science. C-bone receptors are found primarily in the brain and central nervous system, concentrated in regions involved in memory, movement, pain processing, emotional regulation, and the experience of reward. CB2 receptors are found mainly in the immune system and peripheral tissues, and appear to be more involved in inflammation and immune function. Both receptor types respond to the body's own endocannabinoids, and both are also activated by plant-derived cannabinoids like THC, which is why consuming cannabis affects such a wide range of physiological and psychological functions simultaneously. The endocannabinoid system works differently from most neurotransmitter systems in one important respect. It operates in reverse. Most neurotransmitters are released from the presynaptic neuron and travel forward to the postsynaptic neuron to deliver their signal. Endocannabinoids are released from the postsynaptic neuron and travel backward to the presynaptic neuron to regulate how much neurotransmitter gets released in the first place. This retrograde signaling means the endocannabinoid system acts as a kind of volume control for other neurotransmitter systems, dampening activity that's too high, modulating the intensity of signals across the brain. When THC floods this system with artificial cannabinoid activity, it disrupts this volume control function in ways that are far less precise than the body's own regulatory processes. What this system does when it's working normally, without any cannabis involved, is essentially help maintain balance. It's active during exercise, which is now believed to contribute to the runner's high alongside endorphins. It's involved in the forgetting of aversive memories, which may explain why CBD and certain cannabinoid-based treatments show promise in PTSD research. It regulates appetite, which is why the munchies are not a quirk but a pharmacological inevitability. Understanding the endocannabinoid system has become one of the most active areas in neuroscience, not primarily because of cannabis, but because a system this widespread and this fundamental to brain function clearly has implications for medicine that extend far beyond anything the plant itself can address. Walk into any dispensary, sit down at any table where someone's rolling something, or open any cannabis-related corner of the internet, and within approximately 90 seconds, you will hear someone make a confident claim about the difference between indica and sativa. Indica will put you on the couch, they'll say. Sativa will give you energy. Indica is the body high. Sativa is the head high. Indica is for nighttime. Sativa is for creative work. These claims are repeated with enormous confidence by enormous numbers of people, which makes it somewhat awkward that modern cannabis science has largely concluded that the indica-sativa distinction, as most people use it, is not really a reliable predictor of effect. The actual pharmacological experience you get from a cannabis strain has much more to do with its specific cannabinoid and terpene profile than with whether it grew tall and narrow or short and bushy. The original botanical distinction between sativa and indica is real and predates the recreational cannabis market by a long time. Carl Linnaeus classified cannabis sativa in 1753. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck described cannabis indica separately in 1785, noting that plants from India were morphologically distinct, shorter, denser, with broader leaves, and reportedly more intoxicating than European hemp varieties. For botanists, these were meaningful taxonomic observations. For modern cannabis consumers, however, the terms have migrated from botanical description to experiential shorthand in a way that the underlying genetics simply don't support. The core problem is that essentially all modern cannabis strains are hybrids. Decades of intentional and unintentional crossbreeding have blurred the genetic lines between the original sativa and indica phenotypes, to the point where a strain labelled indica might contain substantial sativa genetics and vice versa. Studies comparing the chemical profiles of strains marketed as indica versus sativa have found that the cannabinoid and terpene differences between them are not consistent or predictable enough to reliably produce different effects. The labels are, in large part, marketing categories rather than pharmacological ones. There is one legitimate difference that does tend to correspond loosely to the indica sativa label, and that is the aromatic and terpene profile. Many strains marketed as indica are high in myrcene, a terpene associated with sedation and muscle relaxation, while many marketed as sativa are higher in limonene or terpinolene, associated with more energizing or uplifting effects. So there is a kernel of truth buried in the folk taxonomy, just not where most people think it is. The effect isn't coming from the plant's botanical classification, it's coming from the specific terpenes it produces. The practical upshot of all this is that if you are trying to predict how a particular cannabis product will make you feel, asking whether it's indica or sativa is approximately as reliable as asking whether it was grown indoors or outdoors. What you actually want to know is its cannabinoid ratio, its dominant terpenes, and ideally its THC concentration, information that is increasingly available on legal market products, but which requires reading a label rather than asking a dispensary employee which one is more chill. The chill one, it turns out, is the one with high myrcene and a moderate THC level. The species name is just a story we tell ourselves to feel like we understand what we're buying. If you have ever noticed that different cannabis strains smell dramatically different from each other, one piney, one citrusy, one that smells like actual blueberries in a way that seems biologically improbable, one that smells like something you'd find in a mechanic's garage, and yet somehow this is considered desirable. You have noticed terpenes. Terpenes are aromatic compounds produced by a wide range of plants, including cannabis, and they are responsible for smell, flavour, and, increasingly, scientists believe, a meaningful portion of the variation in how different strains feel when consumed. There are over 100 identified terpenes in cannabis, with names like myrcene, limonene, linalool, and caryophyllene, which sounds like a medieval surname but is actually a terpene found in both cannabis and black pepper, and which is one of the only terpenes known to bind directly to cannabinoid receptors. Myrcene is the most abundant terpene in most cannabis strains, and it smells like earth and musk, with a faintly tropical undertone. It's also found in hops, which is why certain IPAs share an almost unsettling aromatic resemblance with certain cannabis strains, a connection that will ruin at least one dinner party conversation for you if you mention it. Myrcene is associated with sedation and is believed to facilitate the passage of THC across the blood-brain barrier more efficiently, which may be part of why high-mecene strains tend to produce heavier, more physical effects. This is one of the mechanisms scientists point to when discussing the entourage effect. Not just that terpenes have their own effects, but that they may actively modulate how cannabinoids are absorbed and experienced. Limonene predictably smells like citrus. It's found in lemon rinds, orange peels, and cannabis strains with bright, clean aromatic profiles. It appears in the scientific literature in the context of mood elevation and stress reduction, with some evidence from animal studies and limited human research suggesting anxiolytic and antidepressant properties. Linalool smells floral, it's the dominant terpene in lavender, and carries associations with relaxation and sedation that most people will recognize from every spa product ever made. Pinene, which smells exactly like what it sounds like, is found in pine needles and rosemary as well as cannabis, and has been studied for potential anti-inflammatory and bronchodilatory effects. Caryophyllene, the one that binds to CB2 receptors, is spicy and peppery, and its direct cannabinoid receptor activity makes it technically a cannabinoid as well as a terpene, a dual identity that the field is still metabolizing. What makes terpenes genuinely fascinating from a pharmacological perspective is how little we understood them until recently. For most of the history of cannabis research, the focus was almost entirely on cannabinoids, THC, CBD, their molecular relatives. Terpenes were the smell, and the smell was considered secondary. The growing body of research suggesting that terpene profiles meaningfully shape the cannabis experience has reoriented that thinking considerably, and it has practical implications for how products are developed and evaluated. A high THC strain with a calming terpene profile may produce a very different experience than a high THC strain with an energizing one, not because the THC content differs, but because the aromatic chemistry surrounding it does. The honest answer is that terpene science in cannabis is still early. Much of the research is preliminary. Some of it is conducted in vitro or in animal models, and the leap from a study showing that linalool reduces anxiety in mice to a product label claiming it promotes calm in humans is larger than most marketing departments acknowledge. But the direction of the science is clear enough that paying attention to the terpene profile of a cannabis product is increasingly understood to be more informative than looking only at the THC percentage, and considerably more informative than asking whether it's indica or sativa. One of the more interesting and genuinely contested ideas in cannabis science goes by the name the entourage effect, and it suggests something that feels intuitively right to most experienced users, even though it remains scientifically debated. That the various compounds in cannabis, the cannabinoids, the terpenes, the flavonoids, the dozens of other chemical constituents, don't just act independently of each other, but actually interact, modulate each other's effects, and collectively produce an experience that no single compound could produce alone. The idea was first formally proposed by Israeli researcher Raphael Mekulam, the same scientist who first isolated THC in the 1960s, and who has spent most of a remarkable career being one of the most important people in cannabinoid research that the general public has never heard of. The original 1998 paper by Mekulam and colleague Shimon Ben Shabbat wasn't actually about terpenes. It was about how minor endocannabinoids enhance the activity of major ones in the body's own system. But the concept was quickly extended to plant cannabinoids and terpenes, and it gave scientific language to something cannabis users had been observing informally for decades, that whole plant cannabis seemed to behave differently from isolated THC. Synthetic THC had been available as a pharmaceutical, dronabinol, since the 1980s, and patients and clinicians who compared it to whole plant cannabis consistently reported that the two felt different, with isolated THC often described as less controllable, more anxiety-provoking, and less therapeutically useful than full-spectrum preparations. The mechanisms by which the entourage effect might work are several. Terpenes may cross the blood-brain barrier and independently influence neurotransmitter systems, serotonin, dopamine, GABA, in ways that modulate the THC experience. Minor cannabinoids like CBG, CBC, and THCV each have their own pharmacological profiles and receptor affinities, and their presence in whole plant extracts may contribute to the overall effect in ways that are difficult to detect by studying any one compound in isolation. CBD's ability to reduce THC-induced anxiety is one of the clearest examples of cannabinoid-cannabinoid interaction, and it suggests that the ratio of compounds within a strain matters as much as their individual concentrations. Critics of the entourage effect concept point out that most of the evidence is preclinical, meaning it comes from cell studies and animal models rather than controlled human trials, and that the hypothesis is easy to invoke as a general explanation for effects that haven't been rigorously attributed to specific mechanisms. This is a fair point. The entourage effect is sometimes used in marketing as a reason to prefer expensive full-spectrum products over cheaper isolates without scientific evidence specific to the product being sold, which is the kind of application that gives a legitimate scientific hypothesis an unearned commercial edge. What seems most accurate is a middle position, that the entourage effect is a real phenomenon, that the components of cannabis interact in ways that matter, and that the current evidence doesn't yet allow us to specify those interactions precisely enough to reverse engineer them into products with predictable results. The cannabis plant, after 10,000 years of evolution and decades of intensive study, remains genuinely complicated. Every compound doing its own thing, while simultaneously doing something slightly different in the presence of all the others. It's less a workplace drama and more a very large ensemble cast where everyone's lines keep changing, depending on who else is in the scene. On one end of the cannabis spectrum, there are strains so mild that calling them psychoactive almost feels like an overstatement. These are the low THC varieties, plants that have been cultivated either for hemp production, for medical use in populations that need cannabinoid therapy without intoxication, or more recently, for the growing number of recreational users who have learned from experience that they would like to participate in cannabis culture without the part where time stops working and every decision feels cosmically significant. Hemp, legally defined in most jurisdictions as cannabis containing less than 0.3% THC, is the most extreme example. A plant that looks and smells like its more potent cousins, but produces no meaningful high whatsoever, and which has been used for fibre, paper, food, and construction material for thousands of years. Between industrial hemp and the mid-range recreational strains, there exists a growing category of low THC, high CBD products designed specifically for people who want the potential therapeutic benefits of cannabis: reduced anxiety, mild pain relief, improved sleep, without the intoxication. Strains like Harlequin, Charlotte's Web, and AC/DC were among the early examples of deliberately cultivated high CBD, low THC cannabis, and they attracted significant attention partly because of high-profile cases involving children with treatment-resistant epilepsy, whose families sought CBD-rich cannabis at a time when pharmaceutical CBD was not yet available. The publicity around these cases did more to shift public perception of cannabis as a medicine than decades of advocacy had managed. The experience of consuming a genuinely low THC strain for someone accustomed to potent cannabis is, by most accounts, underwhelming in a way that is occasionally confusing. There may be a mild relaxation, a slight shift in mood, a gentle softening of the edges of the day. There is no high in any recognizable sense. For people with high THC tolerance, this can feel like nothing at all. For people who are new to cannabis or who are sensitive to THC, the mild physiological effects of even a low THC product can be noticeable enough to be useful. A reduction in background anxiety, a subtle improvement in sleep quality, nothing that would prevent someone from driving or making decisions or having a normal conversation. What low THC strains reveal, perhaps more than any other category, is how much of the cannabis experience people assume to be pharmacological is actually contextual. The ritual of consumption, the social setting, the expectation of effect, These factors contribute significantly to what someone reports experiencing, and with low THC products, they become the dominant variables because the pharmacological signal is so faint. This is not an argument that the effects aren't real. It's an observation that cannabis, at every potency level, is a product whose effects are shaped by far more than chemistry. The person holding it matters. The room they're sitting in matters. What they were feeling before they started matters. At low doses, those contextual factors stop being background noise and start being the whole story. Most of the cannabis that most people consume most of the time falls somewhere in a comfortable middle band. Strains potent enough to produce a noticeable effect, but not so overwhelming that the experience requires management. These are the strains that make movies funnier, food more interesting, conversation easier, and the general business of being alive slightly less like a bureaucratic slog. They're the ones people pass at parties without incident, share on a back porch on a Tuesday, or consume alone before doing something they find boring but necessary, like folding laundry or attending a virtual meeting with the camera off. The mid-range strains that occupy this territory typically run somewhere between 10 and 18% THC, high enough to produce genuine effects, moderate enough that an experienced user can consume them without scheduling the rest of their evening around recovery. Names in this category tend toward the cheerful and vaguely agricultural Blue Dream, Green Crack, Pineapple Express, Sour Diesel. These are the cannabis equivalent of a reliable domestic beer, not the most sophisticated thing available, not trying to be, and consistently capable of delivering exactly what they promise. There's something to be said for that. Most people, most of the time, are not looking for a profound pharmacological experience. They're looking for a modest improvement in how the next 2 hours feel. The social dimension of mid-range cannabis is worth taking seriously as a genuine phenomenon. Cannabis at moderate doses reliably reduces social inhibition, increases willingness to engage with unfamiliar people or ideas, and produces a kind of mild shared experience in group settings that functions similarly to the first drink of alcohol. It lowers the activation energy required for the conversation to get interesting. This has been true across cultures and centuries. The communal use of cannabis as a social lubricant predates any formal understanding of its pharmacology and the modern version of that same social function. Passing something around a circle, the informal ritual of it, the way it creates a brief shared present. Tense C is recognizably continuous with practices that go back thousands of years. What makes middle ground strains tricky to talk about scientifically is precisely their ordinariness. They don't produce dramatic enough effects to generate alarming case studies. They don't require clinical intervention. They don't offer the kind of extreme experience that generates memorable anecdotes. They just work, in a quiet and unremarkable way, which means the bulk of the evidence about them comes not from clinical trials, but from the lived experience of the hundreds of millions of people who have consumed them. That data, informal and uncontrolled as it is, suggests that moderate cannabis used by healthy adults in appropriate settings produces modest positive effects for most people most of the time. Not a ringing scientific endorsement, but not nothing either. It seems worth spending some time with what a straightforward, unremarkable cannabis experience actually involves, because in a world full of increasingly potent strains, exotic concentrates, and alarmist headlines, the baseline experience of consuming ordinary cannabis gets somewhat lost. A moderate dose of cannabis in an experienced user tends to produce a fairly predictable constellation of effects: mild euphoria, a lowering of social inhibition, heightened sensory perception, meaning music sounds better, food tastes more interesting, and certain kinds of conversations become suddenly and irrationally fascinating, along with some degree of short-term memory disruption, a slowing of time perception, and an increase in appetite so reliable that it has been the subject of actual scientific research. The euphoria component is mediated primarily through the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, the brain's reward circuitry, which THC activates indirectly by suppressing the inhibitory neurons that normally regulate dopamine release. The result is a surge of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, the same brain region involved in the pleasurable effects of most recreational drugs, though cannabis produces this effect through a different mechanism than stimulants like cocaine or amphetamine, and with significantly different downstream consequences. The euphoria from cannabis is generally described as warm, diffuse, and non-urgent, more contentment than excitement, more settling in than revving up. The alteration of sensory perception is one of the most reliably reported features of the cannabis experience, and one of the more genuinely interesting from a neuroscientific perspective. Under the influence of THC, the brain's sensory processing appears to shift in the direction of novelty. Familiar stimuli are processed as if they're new, which produces the phenomenon of finding music you've heard hundreds of times suddenly emotionally overwhelming, or noticing textures and colours with unusual vividness. This isn't the brain receiving new information. It's the brain temporarily suspended from the filtering mechanisms that normally prevent it from paying full attention to everything at once. Time distortion is equally consistent. Cannabis makes time feel slower. Subjectively, an hour can feel like considerably more. This appears to be related to changes in the activity of the basal ganglia, which are involved in the brain's internal timekeeping. The practical consequence is that activities that are normally boring become tolerable, or even pleasant, because the brain's sense of elapsed time is disrupted. This is almost certainly why cannabis pairs so well with repetitive tasks, long films, or cooking, things that benefit from the feeling that you have more time than the clock suggests. It's also why, at higher doses, this same time distortion can tip from pleasant expansiveness into mild alarm, when the distortion becomes strong enough to feel disorienting rather than spacious. The munchies, finally, are not psychological. They are not simply a matter of food tasting better, though it does. They involve THC directly stimulating appetite-regulating neurons in the hypothalamus, overriding the normal satiation signals that tell you to stop eating, and simultaneously enhancing the olfactory processing of food aromas. The brain, under THC, essentially convinces itself that it is hungrier than it is, that food smells better than it normally does, and that the previous hour of eating has not occurred. It is a pharmacological override of the body's energy regulation system, and it works with a consistency that has made cannabis-based appetite stimulants genuinely useful in medical contexts, particularly for patients with cancer or HIV-related wasting syndromes, for whom the inability to eat is a serious and sometimes life-threatening problem, one of cannabis's most distinctive features, and the one most responsible for the anxious phone call from a friend who just had their first edible and is absolutely certain they've overdosed, is its ability to produce, under certain conditions and in certain people, not relaxation but its mirror image, anxiety, paranoia, a sudden intense awareness of one's own heartbeat, a feeling that something has gone wrong in a way that's impossible to specify but feels very real. This paradox sits at the heart of cannabis pharmacology. The same compound, THC, that produces euphoria and relaxation at one dose can produce significant anxiety and paranoid ideation at higher doses, particularly in people who are predisposed to anxiety or who consume more than their system can comfortably process. The mechanism behind cannabis-induced anxiety is not completely understood, but the leading explanation involves the same amplification of sensory processing and time distortion that produces pleasant effects at lower doses. When the amplification becomes intense enough, the brain's threat detection systems, primarily centered in the amygdala, which is richly populated with C-bone receptors, can interpret the altered state itself as a danger signal. The heart rate increases that THC reliably produces can be noticed and misinterpreted as symptoms of cardiac distress. The heightened self-awareness can tip into hypervigilance. The slowing of time can transform from spacious to trapped. Nothing has changed about the external environment. The danger signal is entirely internal, but the brain, under sufficient THC, can lose the metacognitive ability to identify it as such. Paranoia, the specific sense that other people are watching, judging, or somehow conspiring, is a distinct feature of high-dose cannabis that deserves its own moment of consideration. It occurs frequently enough that it has been studied as a specific phenomenon, and the research suggests it is partly related to cannabis's effect on the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for rational evaluation of ambiguous social information. Under high THC, the prefrontal cortex's ability to assess social situations clearly is impaired, and the amygdala's threat detection activity is amplified. The combination produces a state in which ambiguous social cues, someone not making eye contact, a conversation that seems to stop when you enter a room, are interpreted as threatening rather than neutral. From the inside, it feels like certainty. From the outside, it looks like a person doing a convincing impression of someone who has consumed too much cannabis. Individual susceptibility to cannabis-induced anxiety varies enormously and appears to be influenced by genetics, specifically variants in the gene that regulates the enzyme responsible for breaking down anandamide, as well as by pre-existing anxiety disorders, prior negative cannabis experiences, and the setting in which cannabis is consumed. First-time users are particularly vulnerable because they lack the experiential framework to recognize that what they are feeling is temporary and manageable, and because they often underestimate how much they've consumed before the full effect arrives. The practical advice that experienced users offer to someone in the middle of a cannabis anxiety episode: "You're okay, it will pass, drink some water, sit somewhere comfortable," turns out to be pharmacologically sound, even if it doesn't always feel that way from the inside. At some point in the cannabis story, the plant got significantly stronger. Modern high THC strains, the ones that line the premium shelves at dispensaries with names like Gorilla Glue, Wedding Cake, and something called Runts, which sounds like a discontinued candy from the 90s, but is apparently cannabis that people pay a great deal of money for, can contain THC concentrations of 25, 30, or even higher percent, compared to the roughly 3 to 5% typical of cannabis in the 1970s. This increase, driven by decades of selective breeding and increasingly sophisticated cultivation techniques, has fundamentally changed the character of the cannabis experience available to consumers, and not always in the direction of more pleasant. The escalation in potency was not accidental. It was market-driven. Consumers, particularly in black market contexts where quality verification was unavailable, learned to associate stronger smell and more intense effect with higher quality, and breeders responded to that demand by selecting relentlessly for maximum THC expression. Legal markets accelerated this trend rather than reversing it, because dispensary shelves sorted product by THC percentage and consumers, trained to equate higher numbers with better product, reached for the highest testing items. The result was a commercial incentive structure that rewarded potency above everything else, including the balance of other compounds that might have made the experience more nuanced and manageable. The experience of consuming a genuinely high THC strain, particularly for someone without a tolerance calibrated to that potency level, is qualitatively different from the moderate cannabis experience in ways that matter. The onset is faster and more intense. The ceiling of effect is higher, meaning the gap between a pleasant experience and an overwhelming one is narrower and easier to cross. The duration can be longer and less predictable. And the probability of the anxiety and paranoia described in the previous segment rises substantially with THC concentration, because the dose-response relationship for THC anxiety effects is real and consistent across studies. What's particularly interesting from a public health perspective is the mismatch between how high THC products are sold and how their potency actually scales with harm. A 25% THC strain is not simply a little stronger than a 12% strain, in the way that a slightly stronger beer is a little stronger than a regular one. The dose-response curve for THC's anxiety effects appears to steepen in the higher concentration range, meaning that the step from moderate to high-potency cannabis is not a linear one. Researchers studying the effects of potency escalation in legal markets have found increases in emergency department presentations for cannabis-related anxiety and psychosis that correlate with the increasing availability of high-concentration products, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but measurably. For experienced users with high tolerance and good self-knowledge, high THC strains can be exactly what they're looking for, an efficient route to a familiar effect without having to consume large volumes. For newer users, occasional users, or anyone who miscalculates their dose, those same products represent a meaningfully elevated risk of an experience they did not want and will not enjoy. The shelf at the dispensary doesn't come with a warning that reads, "This one is specifically the one most likely to convince you that your ceiling is descending." It probably should. If high THC flower is cannabis turned up to a loud volume, concentrates are cannabis through a stadium speaker system pointed directly at your face. Extracts, which include products known as wax, shatter, butter, rosin, and live resin, all of which have names that sound like they were chosen by someone who wanted to describe the textures of existential crisis, are processed forms of cannabis in which the plant material has been removed, and what remains is almost purely cannabinoids and terpenes, often at concentrations of 60, 70, 80, or even 90% THC. The production methods vary. Butane hash oil, or BHO, uses butane as a solvent to strip cannabinoids and terpenes from the plant material, then removes the solvent through purging processes that produce the various consistency textures the market has given individual names to. CO2 extraction uses pressurized carbon dioxide as a cleaner solvent. Rosin is produced simply by applying heat and pressure to cannabis flower or hash, squeezing out the resinous compounds without any solvent at all, a method that has become popular with home extractors because it requires no specialized chemistry and produces a full-spectrum product. Live resin is made from cannabis that has been frozen immediately after harvest, rather than dried and cured, preserving the terpene profile of the living plant in a way that dried flower cannot. The experience of dabbing, the most common consumption method for concentrates, involving a heated surface called a nail or banger, onto which a small amount of concentrate is dropped, producing an immediate and intense vapour, is difficult to describe to someone who has only ever smoked or vaporized flower. The onset is essentially instantaneous. The intensity is of a different order. Even experienced cannabis users who try concentrates for the first time frequently report that the experience bears only a superficial resemblance to what they know from flower, same general category, completely different magnitude. People who dab regularly develop tolerances that make normal cannabis feel inert, which creates its own set of complications when they try to reduce consumption. The harm profile of concentrates is genuinely more concerning than that of mid-range flower, and not only because of the THC concentration. The solvents used in production, if not fully purged, can leave residual contaminants in the final product. The extraction process can concentrate not only cannabinoids and terpenes, but also any pesticides or heavy metals present in the source material, and the temperatures at which some concentrate consumption methods operate are high enough to produce combustion byproducts that are not present in lower temperature vaporization. None of this is to suggest that concentrates are uniquely toxic. The research base is still thin, but the combination of extreme potency and less understood production variables places them, honestly, in a category that deserves more caution than they tend to receive. There is no cannabis delivery method that has generated more cautionary tales, more panic, more calls to poison control centres that turn out to be completely fine, more regrettable decisions, and more sincere personal commitments to never do that again than the edible. Cannabis consumed orally behaves completely differently from cannabis that is inhaled. And this one pharmacological fact, which is straightforward and well documented and has been explained on the packaging of legal cannabis products in multiple jurisdictions for years, is somehow still responsible for more genuinely bad evenings than almost anything else in the recreational drug landscape. The key difference is metabolism. When cannabis is inhaled, THC passes directly from the lungs into the bloodstream and reaches the brain within minutes. producing onset within 2 to 10 minutes and peak effects within 30 to 60. When cannabis is consumed orally, it passes through the digestive system, is absorbed through the intestinal wall, and travels to the liver before entering the bloodstream. In the liver, THC is metabolized into a compound called 11-hydroxy-THC, which crosses the blood-brain barrier more efficiently than THC itself, and is believed to produce a more intense and longer-lasting psychoactive effect. Onset can take anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours depending on the person, what they've eaten, their metabolism, and other factors that are genuinely difficult to predict. The delay is where most edible disasters originate. A person consumes an edible, feels nothing after 45 minutes, reasonably concludes that either the dose was too low or the product was ineffective, and consumes more. The original dose then arrives, followed by the additional dose, and the cumulative effect is considerably more than intended. This sequence of events has happened to enough people, including, famously, several politicians and journalists who consumed edibles for the first time in newly legal states and then wrote about the experience with varying degrees of dignity, that it has become something of a cultural archetype. The lesson is simple. Start low, wait the full 2 hours before concluding anything, and accept that patience is the one skill edibles require and the one skill most people abandon when nothing is happening. The duration of edible effects is another frequent surprise. Inhaled cannabis typically produces effects lasting 2 to 4 hours. Edibles, due to the slower and more sustained release of 11-hydroxy-THC from ongoing liver metabolism, can produce effects lasting 6 to 8 hours or longer in some individuals. This makes edibles genuinely useful for medical applications. Consistent, prolonged relief from pain or anxiety without repeated dosing, and genuinely inconvenient for recreational users who did not budget 8 hours for the experience. The person who eats an edible at 9 p.m., expecting to be asleep by midnight, and is instead staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., composing an internal monologue about the nature of time, has not been failed by the product. They have been failed by the expectation that edibles follow the same schedule as everything else. They do not. They follow their own schedule, and they are not negotiable about it. There exists a category of cannabis strain whose explicit purpose is to make the idea of getting up and doing things feel not just unappealing, but mildly absurd. These are the heavy indica-dominant varieties, the ones with names that often reference sedation, darkness, or nighttime. The ones that experienced users reach for when they have no obligations left in the evening and would like to fully commit to being stationary. The effects are classically described as couch lock, a state in which the body feels pleasantly heavy, movement becomes theoretically possible but practically unlikely, and the couch begins to seem less like a piece of furniture and more like a reasonable long-term residence. The pharmacology of couch lock is believed to involve the combination of high THC with high myrcene content, the terpene most associated with sedation and muscle relaxation. Myrcene appears to act on the central nervous system in ways that enhance the sedative effects of cannabis, possibly by facilitating the activity of GABA, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. Strains with both high THC and high myrcene concentrations produce a physical heaviness that goes beyond simple relaxation, a genuine reduction in the motivational drive to initiate movement, which feels, from the inside, like your body has independently decided to take the night off and has not asked your permission. Names in this category include Grandaddy Purple, Northern Lights, Hindu Kush, and Purple Kush, strains with long breeding histories specifically selected for their sedating properties. These are the varieties that have found medical utility in managing insomnia, chronic pain, and muscle spasticity, because their ability to pin someone pleasantly to a surface for several hours is not a side effect in those contexts, but a feature. For recreational users who want to watch something long and demanding on a streaming service, while consuming large quantities of food with minimal physical effort, they are the optimal tool. For anyone with plans that evening, they are a significant miscalculation. The couch lock experience raises an interesting question about the nature of impairment that cannabis generally avoids, namely, that there are forms of cannabis consumption that produce functional impairment comparable to significant alcohol intoxication, even if the subjective experience feels different. A person deeply couch-locked on a heavy indica is not dangerous in the way an equivalently intoxicated person on alcohol might be. They are not aggressive, not disinhibited in risky ways, not impaired in motor control to the point of falling. But they are also not able to drive, make clear decisions, or perform tasks that require sustained executive function. The pleasant quality of the impairment can create a false impression that no impairment is occurring, which is a misreading of the pharmacology. The incapacity is real, it just happens to be comfortable. While the cannabis plant itself produces a complex mixture of compounds that have been refined and calibrated by millions of years of botanical evolution and then further by thousands of years of human cultivation, synthetic cannabinoids are something else entirely. They are laboratory-created molecules designed to bind to cannabinoid receptors in the brain, originally produced by pharmaceutical researchers studying the endocannabinoid system, later repurposed, modified, and sold under names like Spice and K2 as legal alternatives to cannabis in the years before widespread legalization made such workarounds unnecessary. The results have been, to use a clinical term, bad. The history of synthetic cannabinoids begins innocuously enough in academic research laboratories. John Huffman, a Clemson University chemist who spent decades synthesizing cannabinoid compounds to study the endocannabinoid system, created hundreds of molecules in his career, catalogued in scientific literature under designations like JWH018, JWH073, JWH133. These were research tools designed to probe receptor function, never intended for human consumption. Then, in the mid-2000s, someone read the papers, identified the molecules, synthesized them in a different kind of laboratory, sprayed them onto plant material, and began selling the result at gas stations and head shops as herbal incense. Legally, because the specific molecules involved were not yet scheduled controlled substances. The experience of consuming synthetic cannabinoids bears only a superficial resemblance to cannabis. Both bind to sebone receptors. That is where the similarity ends. Most synthetic cannabinoids are full agonists at the sebone receptor, meaning they activate it completely, with no ceiling on their activity, while THC is a partial agonist, which means it activates the receptor only partially and has a built-in pharmacological limit to how strongly it can drive sebone activity. The practical consequence of this difference is enormous. Synthetic cannabinoids can drive sebone receptors to intensities of stimulation that plant-derived THC simply cannot achieve, producing effects that range from severe anxiety and paranoia all the way to psychosis, seizures, cardiac arrest, and death. These are not edge cases or theoretical risks. They are documented outcomes from emergency departments in multiple countries. The legal landscape around synthetic cannabinoids has been a perpetual game of catch-up. Each time a specific molecule is scheduled as a controlled substance, manufacturers modify its chemical structure slightly, creating a new, technically legal analogue, and continue selling the product. This has produced an enormous and continuously expanding family of compounds, many of which have never been studied in humans at all, and whose safety profiles are completely unknown. The people who consume them have, in effect, volunteered for an uncontrolled experiment with no ethical review and no informed consent. Synthetic cannabinoids are not cannabis. They are not an alternative to cannabis. They are a genuinely dangerous category of substance that exists because prohibition created a market for legal highs that legitimate cannabis could not legally fill, and which legalization is slowly but not yet completely dismantling. More people cite sleep improvement as a reason for using cannabis than almost any other motivation, and there is a meaningful sense in which this is completely understandable. Cannabis, particularly strains high in myrcene and with significant indica character, does produce drowsiness, does reduce the time it takes to fall asleep, and does create a subjective sense of deep relaxation that translates, for many people, into nights that feel better than unmedicated ones. The pharmacology is real. The experience is real. The problem is that the relationship between cannabis and sleep quality is significantly more complicated than fall asleep faster and wake up rested, and that complication tends to reveal itself most dramatically when the person who has been using cannabis to sleep every night for 2 years decides to stop. Sleep occurs in cycles that alternate between non-REM and REM phases, with REM sleep, the stage during which most dreaming occurs and during which the brain is believed to perform important functions related to memory consolidation, emotional processing, and cognitive restoration, occupying roughly 20 to 25% of total sleep time in adults. Cannabis, specifically THC, suppresses REM sleep. This has been documented consistently across multiple decades of sleep research and appears to be one of the more reliable and reproducible effects of cannabis on sleep architecture. Users who consume cannabis before bed spend less time in REM sleep than they would without it. The short-term practical consequence of REM suppression, less dreaming, often no dreaming at all, is experienced by many cannabis users as a benefit rather than a loss. Dreams can be vivid, disturbing, or simply inconvenient, and the absence of them is not, on its face, unpleasant. The longer-term consequences are less clear but more concerning. REM sleep appears to be involved in emotional regulation and in the processing of memories acquired during the day, and chronic REM suppression has been associated in non-cannabis research with a range of cognitive and emotional problems. What this means specifically for long-term cannabis users who are consistently suppressing REM remains understudied, but it is not a trivial question. When regular cannabis use for sleep is discontinued, the REM rebound that occurs is one of the most disorienting aspects of cannabis withdrawal. The brain, having been deprived of REM sleep for an extended period, overcorrects sharply, producing nights of intensely vivid, often bizarre or disturbing dreams that can last for weeks. This REM rebound is not dangerous, but it is frequently reported as one of the most difficult aspects of stopping cannabis after chronic use, more difficult for many people than any physical withdrawal symptom. The irony is complete. Cannabis helps you sleep by suppressing the part of sleep that appears to be most essential, and when you stop, the bill comes due in the form of weeks of dreams so vivid they feel like a different problem entirely. One of cannabis's most persistent cultural associations is with creativity, with artists, musicians, writers, and thinkers who have used it as a tool for loosening inhibition, making unexpected connections, and accessing a mode of thought that is less constrained by conventional logic. This association is old, widespread, and not entirely without basis. Cannabis does appear to produce what researchers call hyperpriming, an increased tendency to find connections between loosely related concepts, which feels subjectively like a kind of creative expansiveness. The problem is that cannabis also impairs working memory, executive function, and the ability to evaluate whether an idea is actually good, which means it can produce the feeling of extraordinary creativity, while simultaneously degrading the person's ability to accurately assess whether what they've created is extraordinary. The scientific literature on cannabis and creativity is genuinely mixed, which is itself informative. Studies measure in divergent thinking, the ability to generate many different responses to an open-ended prompt, one standard measure of creative potential, find that low to moderate doses of cannabis can enhance it in people who are not already highly creative, while having little or no effect in people who score high on baseline creativity measures. High doses appear to impair divergent thinking even in people it helps at lower doses, following the inverted U-shaped dose-response pattern that shows up repeatedly across the cognitive effects of cannabis. A small amount can, under some conditions, genuinely help. A large amount reliably doesn't. What cannabis may actually be doing, in the cases where it seems to enhance creative work, is reducing the self-critical filter, the internal editor that evaluates and discards ideas before they're fully formed. This filter is useful in most professional and social contexts, where it prevents you from saying every strange thought that passes through your mind. But in creative work, particularly in early stages of idea generation, it can be counterproductive, pruning ideas before they've had a chance to develop into something valuable. Cannabis may temporarily loosen that filter, which feels like freedom and can sometimes function like it, even if the underlying mechanism is inhibitory rather than generative. The famous examples of artists and musicians who used cannabis as a creative tool require some contextual humility. We remember the ones for whom it worked, or appeared to work, and don't have a clean comparison group of equally talented people who tried the same approach and produced nothing worth remembering. Survivorship bias is everywhere in the history of drugs and creativity. What we can say with confidence is that cannabis has been present in some creative processes that produce significant work, that it is not present in many equally significant processes, and that the relationship between the substance and the output is nowhere near as direct or as reliable as the cultural mythology suggests. The music was good because the musician was good. The cannabis was just in the room. The relationship between cannabis and memory is one of the most well-established findings in all of cannabis research, which makes it somewhat ironic that it is also one of the things cannabis users are least likely to voluntarily think about. THC impairs the formation of new short-term memories. This is not a subtle or occasional effect. It is consistent, dose-dependent, and has been documented across hundreds of studies. It happens because the hippocampus, the brain region most centrally involved in converting short-term experience into long-term memory, is absolutely packed with C-bone receptors, which means that THC, when it arrives, binds enthusiastically to those receptors and disrupts the molecular processes through which new memories are formed and consolidated. The specific phenomenon this produces is called anterograde amnesia, an impairment in forming new memories after the intoxicating agent is consumed. This is distinct from retroactive amnesia, which involves forgetting things that happened before. Under cannabis, memories from before consumption remain intact. What becomes impaired is the ability to encode new information in the minutes and hours following consumption. This is why a person having a conversation while high can lose the thread of what they were saying mid-sentence. Why the beginning of a movie watched under cannabis can feel entirely new when rewatched sober, and why the experience of trying to remember something that was definitely said 5 minutes ago can produce a particular quality of blankness that is very specific to this pharmacological state. The memory impairment during acute intoxication is temporary and resolves as THC clears from the system. What is more contested and more concerning is whether chronic heavy cannabis use produces lasting effects on memory that persist beyond the period of acute intoxication. Studies on this question show mixed results, complicated by the difficulty of controlling for confounding variables. The current scientific consensus suggests that heavy long-term use may produce subtle but measurable deficits in certain memory functions, particularly working memory and the ability to rapidly encode and retrieve information that persist for weeks or months after stopping use. Whether these effects are permanent or eventually fully reversible remains an active area of research. What is less contested is the effect of adolescent exposure on memory development. The hippocampus continues to develop through adolescence into the early 20s, and early heavy cannabis use appears to alter hippocampal development in ways that produce more pronounced memory effects than those seen in adults who begin using later in life. This is one of the more consistent findings in developmental cannabis research, and one of the stronger arguments for delay of first use, not because cannabis in a fully developed adult brain is without risk, but because the developing brain appears to be considerably more sensitive to the disruption of systems that are still being built. This is the segment where the tone shifts, because there is a part of the cannabis story that is not funny and not ambiguous and not something that can be explained away by bad dosing or anxious personalities. There is credible, well-replicated scientific evidence that cannabis use, particularly heavy, frequent use of high THC products beginning in adolescence, is associated with an increased risk of psychotic disorders, including schizophrenia. The size of that risk is debated. The causality is complicated. But the relationship is real. It appears in the data consistently across multiple countries and multiple study designs, and it is serious enough that any honest account of what cannabis does across its full range of effects has to include it. The research foundation for this association is substantial. A landmark 1987 Swedish study that followed 50,000 military conscripts over 15 years found that those who had used cannabis heavily at age 18 were over 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia over the following decades than non-users. Subsequent studies in the Netherlands, New Zealand, the United Kingdom and elsewhere have replicated the association with remarkable consistency, adjusting for variables like pre-existing psychiatric symptoms, family history of psychosis, and other drug use. The adjusted risk ratios in most studies cluster around 2 to 3 times the baseline risk for heavy users, meaningful elevations by any epidemiological standard. The causality question is where things get complicated. One alternative explanation is reverse causation, that people who are in the early subclinical stages of psychotic illness are more likely to use cannabis, perhaps because it temporarily relieves some of their symptoms, making it appear that cannabis precedes psychosis when actually the psychosis was developing first. Evidence for this explanation exists, but the prospective studies, which follow people before they develop symptoms, show that cannabis use predicts psychosis onset in a way that is difficult to fully explain through reverse causation alone. The relationship appears to be genuinely bidirectional. People predisposed to psychosis may be more likely to use cannabis, and cannabis use appears to accelerate or trigger psychotic illness in some people who are predisposed to it. What makes this relevant beyond the narrow population with genetic psychosis risk is the potency escalation discussed in earlier segments. Studies examining the relationship between cannabis potency and psychosis risk have found that high-potency cannabis, the kind that now dominates most commercial markets, is associated with higher psychosis risk than lower-potency cannabis in a dose-dependent pattern. This suggests that the increasing strength of available cannabis products is not pharmacologically neutral from a psychosis risk perspective. The risk that existed with mid-century cannabis at 3% THC is not the same risk that exists with contemporary products at 25% or above. The scale has shifted, and the public health implications of that shift are still being calculated. Distinct from the long-term risk of schizophrenia associated with heavy chronic use, there is also the phenomenon of acute cannabis-induced psychosis, a temporary but genuinely alarming state that can occur in people with no prior psychiatric history following a sufficiently large dose of high THC cannabis, particularly concentrates or strong edibles. The experience typically involves loss of contact with reality, paranoid delusions, disorganized thinking, and in some cases frightening hallucinations, symptoms indistinguishable from an acute psychotic episode caused by any other means, and which, if a person were to present at an emergency department without disclosing their cannabis use, would likely be diagnosed as exactly that. The mechanism is an extreme version of the anxiety and paranoia described in segment 11, driven to a threshold where the brain's normal reality testing capacity breaks down entirely. At very high doses, THC appears to produce a temporary hyperdopaminergic state in the mesolimbic system, essentially an overwhelming flood of dopamine activity in the reward circuitry and associated regions that mimics, at least neurochemically, aspects of what occurs in naturally arising psychosis. The prefrontal cortex, which normally applies a rational check to potentially delusional ideation, is simultaneously impaired by high THC concentrations, removing the cognitive brake that would otherwise allow the person to identify what they are experiencing as drug-induced rather than real. The result is a state in which the brain's threat detection apparatus is running at maximum intensity, while the system that would normally evaluate and contextualize that threat is offline. What this feels like from the inside is not well captured by clinical descriptions. The paranoid content of cannabis-induced psychosis tends to be specific and personally threatening rather than abstract. The conviction that people outside the door are planning something, that a sound heard in the next room is meaningful and directed, that the people in the room with you are not who they appear to be. The thoughts feel not like thoughts, but like certainties, arrived at through a logic that makes perfect internal sense and cannot be argued out of by external evidence. Someone in acute cannabis-induced psychosis cannot be talked out of the experience by a calm and reassuring companion, not because they are being unreasonable, but because the part of the brain that would evaluate and update on reassurance is the part that is most severely disrupted. The reassurance goes in and finds nothing to land on. The role of edibles in acute cannabis-induced psychosis deserves specific attention because the delay in onset discussed in segment 14 creates conditions particularly conducive to severe overdose. A person who consumes an edible, feels nothing after an hour, consumes significantly more, and then has the full effect of both doses arrive simultaneously, is at genuine risk of an acute psychotic episode, even if their prior cannabis experience has been entirely unremarkable. This is not a theoretical concern. Emergency departments in legal cannabis markets have documented exactly this pattern repeatedly. Patients presenting with acute psychosis whose entire cannabis history consists of one evening that went wrong, one miscalculation about how much to consume, one failure to wait long enough before concluding the first dose hadn't worked. The dose was the difference between a pleasant evening and a psychiatric emergency, and the dose was arrived at through an error that is easy to make and genuinely unpredictable in its consequences. Acute cannabis-induced psychosis typically resolves within hours to a few days as THC clears from the system, and most people who experience it do not go on to develop persistent psychotic illness. The resolution can be dramatic. A person who arrived at the emergency department in a state of terrified certainty about things that were not real can 24 hours later be entirely lucid and deeply embarrassed. The brain, returned to its normal chemical environment, reasserts its normal function. The experience is genuinely frightening and sometimes traumatic, and some people develop lasting anxiety about cannabis or about their mental health following it, but in the majority of cases there is no lasting psychiatric consequence. The subset for whom acute cannabis-induced psychosis does not fully resolve, for whom the episode marks the beginning rather than a temporary departure from a stable baseline, tends to be people with undetected genetic vulnerability to psychotic disorders, for whom the cannabis served as a trigger that accelerated the onset of an illness that was already developing below the surface. Identifying who belongs to this category in advance is not currently possible. There is no genetic test, no brain scan, no behavioural screening tool that reliably identifies individuals at high risk before a psychotic episode occurs. Family history of psychotic illness is the strongest known risk factor, but even a positive family history does not make cannabis-induced permanent psychosis likely in absolute terms. It raises the risk substantially without making it inevitable. The absence of family history does not eliminate the risk. Cannabis, at sufficient doses, can trigger acute psychosis in people with no identifiable risk factors, simply by virtue of the dose-dependent relationship between THC and dopamine dysregulation. The public health implication of this is uncomfortable but important. There is no currently available way to determine who will experience acute cannabis-induced psychosis before they experience it. The risk factors that are known, high dose, high potency product, naive or low tolerance user, personal or family history of psychosis, use in a high stress setting, are probabilistic guides rather than reliable predictors. A person can have none of these risk factors and still have a very bad night. This is not an argument that cannabis is uniquely dangerous. It is an argument that the dose-response relationship for severe adverse psychiatric effects is real, that the products currently available in most commercial markets make it easy to consume far more than intended, and that the combination of those two facts produces a rate of acute psychiatric adverse events that is higher than it would be with more moderate product potencies and better consumer education about dosing. In the years since CBD became a mainstream consumer product, it has been marketed as a remedy for practically everything: anxiety, pain, inflammation, sleep disorders, autoimmune conditions, and at least one product line that suggested it might be useful for your dog's existential malaise. Most of these claims far outpace the evidence, but there is one area where the science for CBD is genuinely more supportive than the general skepticism about wellness products would suggest: anxiety. Studies on CBD and anxiety, ranging from small clinical trials to laboratory-based research on the pharmacological mechanisms, fairly consistently find that CBD, at the right dose, produces measurable anxiolytic effects, meaning it reduces anxiety. The pharmacological basis for CBD's anxiolytic properties is better understood than for most of its other proposed effects. CBD acts on serotonin receptors, specifically the 5-HT1A receptor, which is the same receptor family targeted by SSRIs, the most commonly prescribed class of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. Unlike SSRIs, which take weeks to build up to their therapeutic effect by gradually increasing serotonin availability at the synapse, CBD appears to produce more immediate effects through direct receptor agonism. It activates the receptor rather than increasing the availability of the neurotransmitter that normally activates it. This difference in mechanism may explain why CBD, unlike SSRIs, does not require weeks of consistent dosing before producing measurable anxiolytic effects in research settings. It also acts on receptors involved in fear memory processing and on the adenosine system, which may contribute to its calming properties through mechanisms entirely separate from serotonin. Clinical studies have tested CBD in several specific anxiety contexts with results that are more consistently encouraging than the general skepticism about wellness products would predict. A widely cited 2019 study published in a peer-reviewed journal found significant reductions in anxiety scores in a patient population taking CBD over a 3-month period, with the majority of patients showing improvement that was sustained across the observation window. Studies using simulated public speaking tasks, a standard laboratory model for social anxiety, chosen because public speaking reliably activates measurable anxiety responses in most people, have found that CBD significantly reduces both the subjective experience of anxiety and its physiological markers, including heart rate and skin conductance compared to placebo. A 2011 randomized controlled study found that CBD reduced anxiety in patients with diagnosed social anxiety disorder in a manner that was both statistically significant and clinically meaningful, with effect sizes comparable to those seen with standard pharmaceutical treatment. The generalized anxiety disorder evidence is thinner and more mixed, partly because generalized anxiety is a more diffuse and harder to model condition than social anxiety, and partly because the trial sizes in this area have been small enough that null results are hard to distinguish from underpowered results. The PTSD evidence is interesting and growing. CBD appears to reduce the intensity of fear memories and to improve sleep quality in PTSD populations, which are two of the primary symptom domains the condition affects, but the trial evidence has not yet reached the threshold required for clinical recommendation. The panic disorder evidence is largely preclinical, based on animal models and human neuroimaging data rather than treatment trials. What is less well understood and less honestly discussed in most commercial contexts is the dose-response relationship for CBD and anxiety. The research literature shows something unusual. CBD's anxiolytic effects appear to follow an inverted U-shaped dose-response curve, meaning that there is an optimal dose range at which effects are strongest, with diminishing or even reversed effects at doses both below and above that range. In most human studies showing significant anxiolytic effects, doses have been in the range of 150 to 300 milligrams. The average CBD gummy or tincture product sold over the counter contains between 5 and 30 milligrams per serving. The arithmetic here is not favourable to the product. This does not necessarily mean that low-dose CBD products are entirely without effect for everyone. Individual pharmacokinetics vary. Some people may respond at lower doses, and the optimal dose range in the published studies may not reflect the full range of individually effective doses in a general population. But it does mean that the marketing claim that a 25 milligram gummy will meaningfully reduce your anxiety is making a promise that most of the clinical evidence does not support for most people. The product is priced as if it is delivering a pharmaceutical intervention. The dose is calibrated for palatability and margin rather than for therapeutic effect. The honest landscape for CBD and anxiety is this. The pharmacological mechanism is real and plausible. The clinical evidence in specific anxiety contexts is more supportive than for most wellness products. The dose required to produce measurable effects is substantially higher than what most consumer products contain, and the long-term safety profile of regular high-dose CBD is understudied but not known to be problematic in healthy adults. For people with significant anxiety disorders, CBD is not a substitute for evidence-based treatment. Therapy, SSRIs, and other established interventions have substantially more clinical evidence behind them. For people with mild to moderate situational anxiety who want a non-prescription option and are willing to use doses in the clinically studied range, CBD has a reasonable evidence base to support a trial. For people buying a $10 gummy pack at a gas station because the label says calm, the expectation should be calibrated accordingly. The CBD story is ultimately a story about what happens when legitimate science, and there is legitimate science here, collides with a commercial machine that has no interest in communicating the nuance. The molecule is interesting. The research is real. The products are, for the most part, inadequately dosed, inconsistently regulated, and marketed with claims that the evidence does not fully support. Somewhere between those two facts is a genuinely useful compound that deserves to be discussed more honestly than either its most enthusiastic commercial boosters or its most dismissive critics are willing to manage. At a certain point in the evolution of cannabis cultivation, the goal of producing the strongest possible product became something approaching a competitive sport. Breeders worked for decades, crossing genetics, selecting for maximum trichome density, testing and retesting cannabinoid profiles, and gradually producing strains that would have been essentially unrecognizable to someone who smoked weed in 1973. The strains that represent the current upper limit of what cannabis plants can produce, varieties like Godfather OG, Bruce Banner and Strawberry Banana, which are regularly tested at 30% THC or above thusn, are products of this deliberate escalation, and experiencing them, even for seasoned users, is often a significantly more intense affair than anything their earlier cannabis experiences prepared them for. Godfather OG, named with a certain theatrical confidence for its supposed position as the don of all cannabis strains, became briefly famous after a 2013 report claimed a tested sample reached 34% THC, a figure that drew both enthusiasm from cultivators and skepticism from researchers who noted that cannabis laboratory testing is imprecise enough that numbers at the extreme end of the range need to be interpreted cautiously. Laboratory testing of cannabis potency uses a process called high-performance liquid chromatography, which is a reliable analytical method, but one whose accuracy varies significantly between facilities. Studies sending identical cannabis samples to multiple testing laboratories have returned THC percentages differing by 5 or more percentage points between labs on the same sample, a variance that matters enormously when it determines whether a product tests at 28 or 33%. The headline numbers attached to the strongest commercial strains represent real potency at the high end of the available range, but the specific absolute values printed on labels should be understood as approximations with meaningful error bars rather than precise pharmaceutical measurements. Bruce Banner, name for the mild-mannered scientist who becomes the Hulk, which is either an extremely on-brand name for a high-THC cannabis strain or a marketing coincidence that someone handled elegantly, emerged from a cross between OG Kush and Strawberry Diesel and gained a reputation as one of the most intensely euphoric high-potency strains available, with an unusually fast onset and a ceiling of effect that experienced users describe as genuinely higher than most comparable strains. The reported THC concentration in some batches has exceeded 30%, and the terpene profile, which includes significant concentrations of myrcene, caryophyllene and limonene, contributes to a complex effect profile that users describe as simultaneously physically heavy and mentally stimulating in the early stages before the sedative aspects become dominant. It sits in the category of strains that are interesting for people with significant tolerance who are chasing intensity and inadvisable as a starting point for anyone without a carefully built tolerance baseline. Strawberry Banana, which, unlike the previous two examples, sounds exactly like a dispensary strain and not at all like a threat, is notable for its exceptionally high terpene content alongside high THC, making it a frequently cited example of the entourage effect in practice. Its flavour profile genuinely resembles its name in a way that seems biologically improbable for a plant, a result of an unusually rich concentration of fruity terpenes alongside its cannabinoid content. It has won multiple cannabis competitions and is frequently cited by cultivators as an example of what selective breeding for terpene expression alongside cannabinoid potency can produce C, a product that is not simply the strongest possible THC delivery mechanism, but something more complex and, by most accounts, more interesting to experience. The cultivation science behind producing strains in this potency range has become sophisticated enough to constitute a specialized field. Environmental controls, precise light spectrum and intensity, carefully managed temperature and humidity cycles, optimized nutrient delivery, are applied with a rigor that would have seemed extraordinary to cannabis growers of an earlier era. Genetic selection has become data-driven, with breeders maintaining detailed records of cannabinoid and terpene expression across multiple phenotype selections from a single cross. The process of finding a new high-expression phenotype in a large population of seeds, stabilizing its genetics through selective breeding across multiple generations, and bringing it to commercial production is a project measured in years rather than months, and it has been pursued with a seriousness of purpose that reflects the commercial stakes of the legal cannabis market. What the existence of these strains reveals most clearly is that the cannabis market has been operating for at least 2 decades with no functional upper limit on potency and no commercial incentive to establish one. A wine producer is constrained by natural fermentation limits. Yeast dies at alcohol concentrations above roughly 15%, which is why fortified wines require the addition of spirits to exceed that level. A distillery operates within a cultural and regulatory framework that recognizes there is a meaningful difference between beer, spirits, and pure ethanol, and imposes different rules on each. Cannabis cultivators and retailers have faced no equivalent framework. The commercial incentive structure has rewarded maximum potency so consistently that the average THC concentration of cannabis in legal American markets has approximately doubled in the past 15 years, with no sign that the escalation has found its ceiling. The public health dimension of this escalation is not catastrophic. Cannabis remains far less harmful in aggregate than alcohol across most measurable metrics. But it is real, and it is growing. The emergency department data from jurisdictions with mature legal markets shows a pattern that should not be entirely comfortable. Presentations for cannabis-related psychiatric emergencies have increased since legalization in many states, and the increase correlates with the availability of high-potency products rather than with overall cannabis prevalence. The strongest strains are not the most dangerous products available in a legal market. That distinction belongs to unregulated concentrates of unknown provenance, but they represent a meaningful step up from what most people's intuition about cannabis risk is calibrated to. The cultural mental model of cannabis risk, formed largely from the moderate potency era before 1990, has not kept pace with what is actually available for purchase. The story of how cannabis became illegal across most of the world in the 20th century is one of the more instructive examples in modern history of policy driven not by science, but by politics, racism, and a specific kind of moral panic that tends to attach itself to things associated with outsiders and the poor. Cannabis had been used medicinally in Western medicine throughout the 19th century, was available in pharmacies, and was a common ingredient in patent medicines sold openly across the United States and Europe. The process by which it went from a legal pharmaceutical product to a Schedule I narcotic in the United States, equivalent in legal terms to heroin, meaning classified as having no medical value and the highest possible abuse potential, is a story that involves Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and a campaign of deliberate misinformation so sustained and effective that it managed to shape global drug policy for the better part of a century. To understand Anslinger, it helps to understand his context. He became commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930, shortly after the end of alcohol prohibition, which had been enforced by his predecessor agency, meaning he inherited a large federal drug enforcement apparatus at the precise moment it had lost its primary mandate and needed a new one. Cannabis, which was spreading through American cities in Mexican immigrant communities and black jazz culture, provided the opportunity. Anslinger recognized that cannabis could serve as the organizing threat his bureau required, and he pursued that opportunity with the particular ruthlessness of a bureaucrat fighting for institutional survival. The campaign he ran was not based on scientific evidence. There was essentially none supporting his claims, but on carefully curated sensationalism designed to produce moral panic. The language Anslinger deployed was explicitly racial. He insisted on calling cannabis marijuana, the Mexican slang term rather than the botanical name then in scientific use, specifically to associate the substance with Mexican immigrants in the minds of legislators and the public. His press releases and congressional testimony attributed to cannabis a nearly supernatural capacity for violence, sexual deviance, and insanity, drawing on a collection of sensational crime stories that he presented as evidence, but which bore no established connection to cannabis use. He told congressional committees that cannabis caused white women to seek sexual relations with black men, a claim so explicitly grounded in racial terror and so completely unsupported by any evidence that its appearance in official government testimony represents a remarkable document of how fear and racism drove policy in the absence of science. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 effectively criminalized cannabis at the federal level by imposing registration and taxation requirements so burdensome that commercial use became practically impossible. The American Medical Association, in testimony before Congress, opposed the legislation. The AMA's representative, Dr. William Woodward, stated directly that the evidence presented for cannabis's dangers was inadequate and that the proposed legislation would prevent legitimate medical research and use. Congress passed it anyway. The response of legislators to scientific and medical objection was essentially to ignore it, not to refute it, not to engage with it, but simply to proceed as if it hadn't been offered. It is a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the history of cannabis policy. The international dimension of prohibition was cemented by the United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, which was drafted under substantial American influence and which placed cannabis in Schedule IV, the most restrictive category, alongside heroin, requiring all signatory nations to prohibit cultivation, production, and trade. This international treaty framework is a significant part of why cannabis prohibition became so globally uniform. Countries that might have developed different policies were constrained by treaty obligations. The treaties have since been amended, and their interpretation has been challenged by the growing number of countries pursuing legalization. but they remain part of the international legal architecture and continue to create complications for countries attempting to move toward legal frameworks. Richard Nixon's declaration of the war on drugs in 1971 placed cannabis at the center of American domestic policy in ways that had profound consequences for millions of people. Nixon had commissioned the Schaefer Commission specifically to provide scientific justification for keeping cannabis in Schedule 1. When the Commission concluded in 1972 that the evidence did not support Schedule 1 classification and recommended decriminalization, Nixon suppressed the report and escalated enforcement. Years later, his aide John Ehrlichman provided what is now the most direct confirmation of what was actually being pursued. The war on drugs, Ehrlichman stated explicitly in a 1994 interview, was designed to disrupt black communities and anti-war protesters. Cannabis was a tool for criminalizing and incarcerating political opponents and racial minorities. The science was never the point. The human cost of a century of cannabis prohibition is difficult to fully account for. In the United States alone, cannabis arrests have totaled more than 20 million since 1970. With black Americans arrested at rates roughly 4 times higher than white Americans, despite similar usage rates across racial groups. A disparity so consistent and so large that it cannot be explained by anything other than racially discriminatory enforcement. The collateral consequences of a cannabis arrest, difficulty accessing employment, housing, federal student loans, professional licenses, have cascaded across generations of families. The research opportunities lost to Schedule 1 restrictions have delayed by decades the development of medical applications that might have benefited enormous numbers of patients. When the history of cannabis prohibition is described as having nothing to do with science and everything to do with race and power, this is not rhetorical exaggeration. It is the documented historical record. Cannabis occupies radically different cultural and legal positions depending entirely on where in the world you happen to be standing, which is one of those facts that becomes more surreal the longer you think about it. In the Netherlands, cannabis has been tolerated in coffee shops since the 1970s under a policy of official non-enforcement that technically remains illegal at the national level, while being openly practiced at the local one. In Jamaica, the Rastafari movement uses cannabis as a sacrament in religious practice, a deeply intentional spiritual relationship that has very little in common with recreational use. In parts of India, bhang, a preparation made from cannabis leaves, is consumed during religious festivals and is available for purchase at government-licensed shops. The Dutch coffee shop system deserves a closer look because it is one of the longest-running natural experiments in cannabis decriminalization in the world, and the results are genuinely instructive. The policy, formalized in the 1970s under a principle of gedoogbeleid, official tolerance, allowed licensed establishments to sell small quantities of cannabis to adults while technically maintaining its illegal status in law. The reasoning was pragmatic. Dutch public health officials believed that separating the cannabis market from the harder drug market would reduce the likelihood of cannabis users encountering and transitioning to more dangerous substances. Decades of data from the Netherlands suggest that cannabis use rates there are not dramatically different from neighbouring countries with stricter enforcement, which is a quiet but significant rebuke to the claim that legal availability automatically produces mass uptake. In Morocco, the Rif Mountains have produced hashish for export to European markets for centuries, a deeply embedded agricultural and economic tradition that exists in legal grey areas domestically while supplying a significant portion of the hash consumed in southern Europe. The farmers who grow cannabis there are not counterculture rebels or drug entrepreneurs in any meaningful sense. They are agricultural communities doing what their families have done for generations, in a region where the land and climate suit the crop and the alternatives are limited. The Rif region is one of the poorest in Morocco, and cannabis cultivation is frequently the primary economic activity sustaining entire villages. The moral framing applied to their product by the countries it is exported to says considerably more about those countries than about the cultivation itself. Morocco has been moving, slowly and inconsistently, toward formal legalization of cannabis cultivation for medical and industrial purposes, a shift driven less by progressive drug policy thinking than by the practical reality that prohibition has never stopped the industry. In Japan, cannabis carries one of the most severe legal and social stigmas in the world. Possession of even small amounts can result in prison terms and permanent professional consequences. In a country where the plant itself was historically integral to Shinto religious practice, and where hemp cultivation was widespread before American occupation authorities imposed US-style prohibition in the post-war period. The severity of Japanese cannabis prohibition is, in some meaningful sense, an American cultural export that overrode an indigenous relationship with the plant that predated it by centuries. Japanese hemp was used to make rope for Shinto shrines, clothing for priests, and purification tools in religious ceremonies. The word for hemp in Japanese, iyase, appears in ancient texts that predate the prohibition by 1,000 years. What was imposed after the war was not a reflection of Japanese values toward cannabis. It was a reflection of American ones, applied with the administrative authority of occupation. The Indian relationship with cannabis is perhaps the most layered. Bhang, a preparation typically made by grinding cannabis leaves and flowers into a paste and mixing them with milk, spices and sugar, has been consumed in India for at least 3,000 years and has deep roots in Hindu religious tradition, associated specifically with the god Shiva, who is said in certain texts to have discovered cannabis and used it as a divine aid. Bhang is consumed openly during festivals like Holi and Mahashivaratri, sold at licensed government shops in several states, and treated as a cultural institution rather than a drug problem, even as India maintains prohibition on other forms of cannabis consumption. The distinction between bhang, which is legal, and ganja or kharas, which are not, is a legal quirk that reflects less pharmacological difference than historical and cultural classification. A reminder that the line between legal intoxicant and prohibited substance is drawn by human beings with particular cultural assumptions rather than by any inherent property of the molecule. In Ethiopia, Kenya, and other parts of East and Central Africa, cannabis, known locally as khat in some regions, though that is a separate plant, or as dagga in southern Africa, has traditional use histories that predate European contact, and that have been variously suppressed or tolerated depending on the colonial and post-colonial policy environments of individual countries. The pattern repeats across the African continent, a plant with deep indigenous roots, subjected to prohibition frameworks imported from European colonizers and American drug policy, now sitting in legal ambiguity as those frameworks are gradually questioned. What emerges from a survey of global cannabis relationships is that there is no universal human response to this plant, no culture that has encountered it and simply left it alone, and no consistent logic to which uses are permitted and which are prohibited. Cannabis is both sacrament and scourge, medicine and menace, agricultural staple and criminal contraband, often simultaneously, in the same country, depending on who is holding it and what their social position is. The chemistry of the plant does not change across borders. The meaning assigned to it changes completely. And that gap between pharmacology and politics, between what cannabis actually is and what various societies have decided to call it, is one of the stranger documents of human cultural history. The relationship between cannabis and medicine is older than most people realize and more complicated than most advocates or critics want to acknowledge. Cannabis has been used medicinally in various cultures for thousands of years, and its reputation as a medical tool predates its recreational use in many parts of the world. In modern pharmacology, the picture is neither the simple dismissal of cannabis as a substance with no medical value, the official position of many governments for most of the 20th century, nor the maximalist claim that it cures everything from cancer to chronic loneliness that occasionally surfaces in wellness culture. The truth is more specific. There are a relatively small number of conditions for which the evidence for cannabis as a medical treatment is reasonably strong, and a much larger number of conditions for which the evidence is suggestive but not yet conclusive. The clearest medical evidence for cannabis-derived treatment is for the epilepsy conditions discussed in the CBD segment, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome, for which the FDA-approved pharmaceutical cannabidiol has demonstrated efficacy in randomized controlled trials. This is the hardest evidence in the field. Beyond epilepsy, the next strongest body of evidence is for chronic pain, particularly neuropathic pain, the persistent, often burning or electric pain that follows nerve damage from conditions like diabetes, multiple sclerosis, or chemotherapy. Multiple systematic reviews of the clinical literature have found that cannabis and cannabinoid-based treatments produce modest but measurable reductions in chronic pain scores in a meaningful proportion of patients, particularly in people who have not responded adequately to other treatments. Chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting is another area where the evidence is solid. Synthetic THC, dronabinol, has been FDA approved for this indication since the 1980s, and clinical experience has confirmed that cannabinoids can be effective antiemetics, particularly for the nausea that standard anti-nausea medications fail to control. Multiple sclerosis-related spasticity has regulatory approval for a cannabis-based treatment. Nabiximols, sold as Sativex, in several countries including the United Kingdom and Canada, following clinical trial evidence that it reduces the frequency and severity of muscle spasms in a meaningful proportion of MS patients. These are not fringe applications. They are treatments with regulatory approval in multiple jurisdictions, prescribed by mainstream clinicians, used by real patients with real results. Glaucoma, the increased intraocular pressure that can damage the optic nerve, was one of the earliest proposed medical uses for cannabis, and the condition that anchored much of the early medical cannabis advocacy in the United States. It is true that cannabis reduces intraocular pressure, and this effect is well documented. The problem is duration. The pressure reduction lasts only a few hours, which would require dosing 6 to 8 times per day to maintain continuous effect, producing continuous intoxication in a patient population that includes many elderly individuals who may not tolerate that well. Pharmaceutical treatments for glaucoma achieve equivalent or better pressure control with once or twice daily dosing and no psychoactive effect. Cannabis for glaucoma is medically interesting but practically outclassed. The appetite stimulation effect of THC, the munchies, in clinical language called appetite stimulation or orexigenic effect, has found genuine medical utility in conditions characterized by severe appetite loss and wasting. HIV-related wasting syndrome, cancer cachexia, and the appetite suppression produced by certain chemotherapy regimens represent contexts where the ability to make someone genuinely hungry has real medical value. Dronabinol is approved for this indication as well, and while it has largely been supplanted by more targeted pharmaceutical options for HIV-related anorexia, it remains a clinically useful tool in oncology contexts where patients are losing dangerous amounts of weight and conventional appetite stimulants have failed. PTSD represents one of the more interesting and genuinely contested frontier areas of medical cannabis research. A significant proportion of medical cannabis users in states with PTSD on the qualifying condition list report meaningful symptom relief, reduced nightmares, reduced hypervigilance, improved sleep, lower overall anxiety load. The biological rationale is plausible. The endocannabinoid system is involved in fear memory processing, and there is preclinical evidence that cannabinoids can impair the reconsolidation of fear memories in ways that could theoretically be therapeutic. Small clinical trials have produced encouraging results, but the randomized controlled trial evidence is not yet at the level required for standard clinical recommendation, and the fact that cannabis also suppresses REM sleep, potentially interfering with the natural emotional processing that occurs during dreaming, introduces a complication that the research has not yet fully resolved. The conditions for which cannabis is most commonly used medically in jurisdictions where it is legal, anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, generalized chronic pain, are precisely the conditions for which the evidence base is weakest and the risk of dependence is most relevant. Anxiety is the clearest example of this mismatch. CBD has reasonable evidence for anxiolytic effects as discussed. THC, by contrast, reliably reduces anxiety at low doses and reliably worsens it at high doses, a therapeutic window so narrow that it requires careful personal calibration that most patients are not in a position to perform accurately. Using high THC cannabis to manage anxiety is, for many people, a short-term solution that produces long-term tolerance and withdrawal effects that can amplify the anxiety it was trying to address. What honest medical cannabis advocacy looks like is not a rejection of the evidence of harm, but an honest accounting of both sides of the ledger. Cannabis is a real medicine for some conditions. It carries real risks for some populations. The appropriate medical use of cannabis looks like the appropriate medical use of any pharmaceutical, targeted, monitored, dosed carefully, and evaluated continuously for whether the benefits are outweighing the costs for the individual patient. One of the less discussed aspects of cannabis pharmacology is what happens to the brain over time with regular use. Cannabis tolerance, the phenomenon by which the same dose that produced significant effects in a new user produces noticeably less effect in someone who has been using consistently for months or years, is not simply a matter of psychological habituation. It is a documented neurobiological process in which the brain actually reduces the number of carbone receptors it expresses in response to prolonged cannabinoid exposure, a process called downregulation, which means the receptor infrastructure that THC relies on to produce its effects is progressively dismantled through the very act of repeated use. This receptor downregulation has been observed directly in neuroimaging studies of chronic cannabis users, which show measurably reduced C-bone receptor density in several brain regions, including the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the striatum, compared to non-users. The reduction is not uniform across brain regions. Areas with the highest baseline C-bone density show the most pronounced downregulation, which means the regions most sensitive to THC in a naive user become the most tolerant in a chronic one. The prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, regions central to executive function and memory, respectively are among the most heavily affected, which has implications not only for the intoxicating effects of cannabis, but potentially for the cognitive functions those regions serve during periods of both intoxication and sobriety. The recovery from tolerance is documented but slower than most people assume. When cannabis use is discontinued, C-bone receptor density recovers over a period of weeks to months rather than days, and recovery appears to be non-uniform across brain regions. Studies using positron emission tomography, PET imaging, to track receptor recovery in recently abstinent cannabis users have found that recovery in some regions is substantially complete within 4 weeks, while other regions continue recovering beyond that window. The practical significance of this is that the commonly discussed tolerance break of a week, which many regular users employ before situations where they want cannabis to be more effective, like concerts or social occasions, is likely producing only partial receptor recovery, and the more complete reset requires considerably longer abstinence. Behavioral tolerance, distinct from receptor downregulation, also develops with regular cannabis use. Experienced users become better at performing certain tasks while intoxicated, not because the drug is less intoxicating, but because they have learned to compensate for its effects, to redirect attention more deliberately, to recognize and manage short-term memory lapses, to navigate social situations despite altered perception. This acquired functional competence is real and has been documented in laboratory studies comparing the performance of experienced and naive users on tasks performed under cannabis. But it is important to distinguish this compensatory competence from the absence of impairment. The impairment is still present. The person has simply gotten better at working around it. A driving simulator study finding that experienced cannabis users perform better than naive ones is not evidence that experienced users drive safely after consuming cannabis. It is evidence that they drive less dangerously than people who have never been high before, which is a different and considerably more modest claim. The tolerance-dependence continuum is worth examining carefully, because tolerance is not the same as dependence, and the distinction matters for how regular cannabis use is understood and discussed. Tolerance means a given dose produces less effect. Dependence means the absence of the drug produces negative effects. Tolerance can exist without dependence. A person can develop cannabis tolerance and discontinue use without experiencing significant withdrawal, particularly if they use moderately and do not accelerate their dosing in response to tolerance. But tolerance is frequently the first step toward dependence, because the natural response to reduced effect is increased dose, which deepens neuroadaptation and makes the system more reliant on cannabinoid input to maintain its normal baseline function. The experience of high-tolerance chronic cannabis users, for whom very large doses produce modest effects that a naive user would find overwhelming, is sometimes presented as evidence that heavy cannabis use is safe, because high-tolerance users appear to function relatively normally at doses that would incapacitate someone without tolerance. This framing inverts the logic. The tolerance is itself the evidence that the brain has undergone significant neuroadaptation. A person who can consume a gram of concentrate without apparent impairment has not discovered that cannabis is harmless at that dose. They have demonstrated that their endocannabinoid system has been so substantially downregulated that it requires enormous external cannabinoid input to achieve what their system once produced with much less. The endpoint of that process is not safety. It is a brain that has rebuilt itself around a chemical that it did not need before and cannot easily do without now. What tolerance ultimately reveals about cannabis is the same thing it reveals about all psychoactive substances that produce receptor downregulation. The brain is adaptive, persistent, and not passive in the face of repeated chemical intervention. It responds, it adjusts, it recalibrates. And every recalibration toward greater tolerance is simultaneously a recalibration away from the baseline the person started with. Whether that matters depends on the dose, the frequency, the duration, and the individual variables that make blanket statements in either direction unreliable. But the pharmacology is not ambiguous. Regular cannabis use changes the brain in measurable ways, and those changes take measurable time to reverse. For most of the decades during which cannabis was primarily framed as harmless and non-addictive, a framing that served a useful political purpose in pushing back against the absurd exaggerations of reefer madness-era propaganda, but which was not entirely accurate. Cannabis withdrawal was either denied or dismissed as psychological rather than physical, and therefore not a real medical concern. The current scientific consensus is more nuanced. Cannabis use disorder, as it is formally classified, affects somewhere between 9 and 30% of people who use cannabis regularly depending on how frequency and dependence are defined, and it comes with a withdrawal syndrome that is real, documented, and for some people, genuinely difficult to manage. Cannabis withdrawal syndrome was formally recognized in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatric Conditions, in 2013, following sufficient accumulation of evidence that its existence could no longer be reasonably contested. The syndrome typically begins within 1 to 3 days of stopping regular heavy cannabis use, peaks around 1 week, and resolves within 2 weeks in most cases, though some symptoms, particularly sleep disruption and mood effects, can persist for weeks or months in heavy long-term users. Symptoms include irritability, anxiety, depressed mood, restlessness, decreased appetite, insomnia, and in some people, physical symptoms like headache, sweating, and chills. Not medically dangerous in the way alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal can be, but genuinely uncomfortable and functionally disruptive. The irritability component of cannabis withdrawal deserves particular attention because it is among the most consistently reported symptoms and the most damaging to the social and professional environments of people attempting to stop. The irritability is not simply a bad mood. It presents, in many people, as a hair-trigger emotional reactivity that is qualitatively different from their normal temperament, disproportionate frustration with minor inconveniences, a shortened fuse in situations that would normally be handled without difficulty, and a pervasive sense of being bothered by everything. People in cannabis withdrawal sometimes describe it as feeling like they're at the wrong voltage for the world. Everything's slightly too loud, slightly too demanding, slightly too much. For people who live with partners, children, or co-workers, this 2-week period can be socially costly in ways that make the practical experience of withdrawal considerably harder than the symptom list alone suggests. The sleep disruption during cannabis withdrawal is addressed in part by the REM rebound discussed in the sleep segment, but it extends beyond unusually vivid dreaming. Insomnia, difficulty falling asleep and staying asleep, is one of the most common and distressing withdrawal symptoms, and it is particularly cruel given that sleep disturbance is one of the primary reasons many people began using cannabis in the first place. The person who has been using cannabis nightly to manage insomnia, and who then stops, is not simply returning to their pre-cannabis baseline. They're experiencing a withdrawal-driven insomnia that is often worse than what they started with, at least temporarily, followed by the REM rebound, followed eventually by a gradual return toward whatever their natural sleep looked like before cannabis involvement. The timeline through all of this can feel very long when you're in the middle of it and have been awake since 2 a.m. Appetite suppression is another withdrawal feature that catches some people off guard. Cannabis reliably increases appetite through its action on hypothalamic appetite-regulating neurons, and when that stimulus is removed, appetite often drops significantly below normal in the first week of withdrawal. For most people, this is a minor inconvenience. For people who are already underweight, managing an eating disorder, or relying on cannabis-stimulated appetite for medical reasons, it is a more serious problem. Nausea without vomiting is also commonly reported, adding insult to the already considerable injury of feeling too anxious to eat, too irritable to sleep, and too uncomfortable to sit still. The existence of cannabis withdrawal does not make cannabis equivalent to heroin, alcohol, or even nicotine in its dependence potential. The severity and medical risk of withdrawal exist on a spectrum, and cannabis sits at the milder end of that spectrum, uncomfortable but not dangerous, manageable without medical supervision in most cases, and substantially less physically intense than withdrawal from alcohol, opioids, or benzodiazepines. What it does share with those substances is the basic architecture of dependence, a brain that has adapted to the presence of a chemical, producing negative consequences when that chemical is removed, consequences that reliably resolve when the chemical is reintroduced. That architecture is worth understanding clearly, without either exaggerating it into the territory of reefer madness or minimizing it into non-existence for political convenience. Treatment for cannabis withdrawal and cannabis use disorder is primarily behavioral, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, and contingency management have the strongest evidence bases, with no pharmaceutical intervention currently approved specifically for cannabis dependence, though several are under investigation. The absence of approved pharmacotherapy does not mean treatment is unavailable or ineffective. Behavioral approaches produce meaningful outcomes for a substantial proportion of people who engage with them. What it means is that the treatment infrastructure for cannabis use disorder is less developed than for alcohol or opioid dependence, partly because the problem has been less medically acknowledged for longer. That is beginning to change slowly as the clinical reality of cannabis dependence becomes harder to explain away. Among all the complications, nuances, and genuine uncertainties in cannabis research, the evidence around adolescent use is the least ambiguous and the most consistently concerning. The human brain is not fully developed until the mid-20s, and during adolescence it is in a period of active construction, pruning synaptic connections, reinforcing frequently used pathways, and building the neural architecture of adult cognition. The endocannabinoid system plays a significant regulatory role in this developmental process, which means that introducing large amounts of exogenous cannabinoids during this critical window is not a neutral act. Studies consistently show that adolescents who use cannabis heavily show different patterns of brain development than those who don't, with particular effects on regions involved in memory, executive function, and emotional regulation. The hippocampus, the memory center discussed earlier, appears to be particularly sensitive to cannabis exposure during adolescence. Studies using brain imaging have found that adolescent-onset cannabis users show structural differences in the hippocampus compared to both non-users and adult-onset users of comparable frequency, suggesting that the developing hippocampus is more vulnerable to cannabinoid-driven alterations than the mature one. The differences observed are not dramatic on any individual scan. This is not visible brain damage in any conventional sense, but they are statistically consistent across studies, and they correlate with functional differences in memory performance. Longitudinal studies have found that adolescent cannabis use predicts poorer performance on memory tasks years later, even after controlling for other variables, and that the effect is more pronounced the earlier use began and the more heavily it was used. Executive function, the set of cognitive abilities including planning, impulse control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility, also appears to be affected by adolescent cannabis use in ways that extend beyond the acute intoxication effects. The prefrontal cortex, which is the last brain region to fully mature and which is the primary substrate of executive function, is undergoing significant active development throughout adolescence. The endocannabinoid system is involved in regulating the synaptic pruning and myelination that occur during this development, and disrupting that regulatory system with exogenous cannabinoids appears to alter the developmental trajectory in measurable ways. The result is not dramatic cognitive impairment that anyone around the person would notice in daily life, but a subtle shift in the functional ceiling of certain cognitive domains, a reduction from what might have been, which by definition cannot be compared to an observable baseline. The relationship between adolescent cannabis use and psychosis risk, discussed in the psychosis segment, is particularly pronounced for early onset use. Studies examining the association between age of first cannabis use and subsequent psychosis risk have found a dose-response relationship with age. The earlier use begins, the higher the relative risk. Users who began before age 15 show substantially higher rates of subsequent psychotic disorder than those who began between 15 and 18, who in turn show higher rates than those who began after 18. This pattern is consistent with the developing brain's heightened sensitivity to the dopaminergic effects of THC, and it suggests that the psychosis risk associated with cannabis is not uniformly distributed across the population of users, but is concentrated in those who begin young. Emotional regulation is a third domain where adolescent cannabis use appears to leave a signature. The amygdala, the brain's primary threat detection and emotional processing center, undergoes significant development during adolescence, and its maturation is closely connected to the development of the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate emotional responses. Several studies have found that adolescent cannabis use is associated with differences in amygdala reactivity and prefrontal amygdala connectivity, the neural circuit most directly involved in the top-down regulation of emotional responses. In practical terms, this translates to findings that adolescent cannabis users show altered emotional reactivity and poorer emotional regulation compared to non-users, differences that persist beyond the period of active use. The challenge in communicating this evidence to adolescents and their families is that none of these effects are certain, dramatic, or immediately visible. An adolescent who uses cannabis heavily will not necessarily develop psychosis, will not necessarily perform significantly worse in school, and will not necessarily look different from peers who don't use. The effects are probabilistic and aggregate. They show up clearly in population-level data and become invisible at the individual level, which makes them easy to dismiss from the perspective of any single person who used cannabis as a teenager and turned out fine. This is the same cognitive error that makes the cancer risk of smoking easy to dismiss during adolescence, when the consequences are decades away, and the people around you who smoke also appear to be fine. The risk is real, it is just not immediate, and the developing brain, which is by developmental design more weighted toward immediate reward than future consequence, is poorly calibrated to take it seriously. What the evidence most clearly supports is a straightforward recommendation: delay. Not abstinence forever, not moral condemnation of adolescent experimentation, but a genuine science-based case for pushing first use as late as possible. Every year of brain development that occurs before first cannabis use is a year during which the endocannabinoid system has served its regulatory function without external interference. The brain that arrives at first use at 20 is genuinely more resilient to its effects than the brain that arrives at first use at 14. That is not a guess or a scare tactic. It is what the neuroscience says, as clearly as neuroscience says anything. And so here we are. The end of a very long, very strange, very green evening together. You have travelled tonight from the trichomes of a flowering plant in the Hindu Kush all the way to the emergency departments of the 21st century. You have met the endocannabinoid system, the quiet, ancient architecture your brain was running long before anyone thought to ask why. You have sat with the science of sleep, the paradox of creativity, the uncomfortable honesty of withdrawal, and the part of the story that nobody particularly wants to tell, but that the data keeps insisting on anyway. You have watched a plant become a sacrament, a medicine, a criminal, a commodity, and a subject of more passionate disagreement per square inch than almost anything else in modern life. And through all of it, what emerges, underneath the politics and the potency and the marketing and the fear, is something genuinely human. The desire to feel differently than you feel, to soften the edges of a day that had too many edges, to sleep when sleep won't come, to sit with friends in a room and let the conversation go somewhere it wouldn't have gone otherwise, to find in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday some small access to wonder. These are not trivial impulses, they are old ones, older than the dispensary, older than the coffee shop, older than the Marijuana Tax Act and Harry Anslinger, and every newspaper headline that has ever called this plant either a miracle or a menace. People have been reaching for cannabis for 10,000 years, and they have been reaching for it because being alive is occasionally difficult and occasionally beautiful and sometimes both at once, and they wanted a little help with the navigation. That doesn't mean it's without risk. You know that now, more than you did at the beginning of the evening. The dose matters, the age matters, the frequency matters, the product matters, the person matters. Cannabis is not a monolith, not a simple bad thing or a simple good thing, but a complicated pharmacologically rich substance that behaves differently in different people, and at different doses and in different life stages, and that deserves to be understood clearly rather than through the distorting lens of either the prohibitionist nightmare or the enthusiast's dream. The truth, as it usually does, sits somewhere more interesting than either extreme, and the people who came before us, the ancient Central Asian communities who first noticed what this plant could do, the Indian priests who made it sacred, the Moroccan farmers who grew it in the Rift Mountains for generations, the scientists who spent careers in relative obscurity mapping its chemistry, even the patients who pushed for medical access in the decades when admitting you used cannabis for anything could cost you everything. They did the work of moving the conversation toward honesty, slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly. They insisted that the plant deserved to be understood rather than merely feared. So tonight, as you lie there in your clean and comfortable and blessedly ordinary bed, perhaps spare a quiet thought for Raphael Mechoulam, still working in his Jerusalem laboratory well into his 90s, convinced that the endocannabinoid system holds therapeutic secrets the world hasn't found yet. For the Dravet syndrome children whose seizures stopped when the medicine finally arrived, for every person who sat through a withdrawal that felt like it would never end and came out the other side, and yes, perhaps even for the person who ate too much of an edible one evening and spent several hours lying on a bathroom floor learning more about their own nervous system than they had intended to. They survived, they were fine, and they definitely waited the full 2 hours after that. The plant is complicated, the science is honest when it's allowed to be, and you, lying there, warm and quiet, with all of it settling into something like understanding, you're exactly where you should be. Let the questions go for tonight. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, The answers will still be there in the morning. Sleep well.